And to all of you for joining. I see a lot of familiar faces here. Thanks for taking some time this morning. As mentioned, I'm the founder and president of the Millennial Action Project. We're dedicated to activating young lawmakers to bridge the partisan divide on generational issues. And these are two generational issues, the national debt and climate change, that motivated us in the early days to even start a project like this. And I want to share two of those formative experiences that motivated us. The first one on the debt. I remember exactly where I was in December of 2010 when the lame duck Congress and the president brokered a compromise on what to do about the Bush tax cuts and what to do about extending unemployment benefits. And after a lot of partisanship and gridlock, finally the leaders, Boehner and Obama and others, came to a bipartisan agreement to do both, to extend the Bush tax cuts and to continue unemployment benefits and other assistance for middle-class families. And I remember reading the New York Times article at the time. I was sitting in my apartment in Madison, Wisconsin. I did get the Wisconsin reference in there. Seeing this one line after the compromise was laid out, and it says, these $900 billion over the next 2 years will be financed entirely with debt spending. So that's another way of saying these $900 billion will be financed entirely by young people and future generations. I remember sitting there thinking, who is actually in Congress looking and thinking about the future? This is a generationally inequitable and I think unmoral kind of compromise that these leaders are doing, and it was seen generally as a good thing. And that, to me, was a sign that we have the wrong frame and the wrong type of leaders in Congress. Second experience on climate change, and prior to starting MAP, I was pretty active in the climate change space. This was at the World Bank, and working there on sustainable energy and climate change issues. We had just produced a wonderful report on sustainable energy and working on different power plants, how they can reduce their carbon emissions. I remember sitting down one day with the chief economist that summer, it's the summer of 2012, asking her, what are the main inhibitors to implementing our green growth strategy? Spent a lot of time on this report. Now, what are the roadblocks to implementing it? And she said there are three issues. One is financing, two is infrastructure, and three is political dysfunction. She said, I feel confident about solving the first two, and I'm absolutely hopeless about the third. And when we're talking about political dysfunction, the main feature in my view and the view of the founders of MAP was one of those main features is political polarization and intense partisanship. And it was in that time that we started to realize, as millennials, that these generational issues will not change unless we addressed that primary linkage of polarization and dysfunction with short-term policymaking. And that was referenced on the last panel. When you're governing in a crisis mode, from crisis to crisis, it's always easiest to either put a Band-Aid on or just to kick the can down the road and let someone else solve it in the future. But if you can reframe these issues in terms of future progress, then maybe you could build some unlikely coalitions. And by the way, there's Nat. Your slide that had future progress versus vulnerability, I was standing in the back thinking, God, I hope the bar is much higher on the left side, and it was. So thank you so much, Nat, for that slide. Very helpful. And reinforces in many ways the premise of our organization. So thank you for that. And we realized that if you can frame it in terms of that future way, and to your point about legacy thinking, it wouldn't just be about young people who are saying we need long-term solutions. It would also be more senior members of society. I'll never forget when we were launching the Congressional Future Caucus on the Hill, we had, of course, all of the few millennials at the time join the caucus, but on our way to the committee room, there were a number of more senior members including then the oldest member of Congress, who came out of elevators, out of hallways, and they said, "Can we join your caucus?" And we saw that happen at the state level too. Usually the answer has been yes. And the reason is because we're seeing some of the most senior members of these legislatures saying that they want to, in your legacy framework, we want to leave a positive legacy. We want to leave the world better off for our children and grandchildren. And when you see it in that kind of nonpartisan frame, then you can start to throw a lot of different types of solutions from across the spectrum at the problem and look at it in a much more pragmatic way. The one thing I've realized over the last one of the things I've realized over the last 7 years or so working on this sort of project with Millennial Action Project is that there are a lot of amazing ideas out there, and Brookings Institution is usually an author of those good ideas. And the Bipartisan Policy Center is another great author of good ideas. I've been in meetings where we look at the issue of the debt and look at the different policy levers that you can utilize to bring down the debt. Some are more right-leaning, some are more left-leaning, some are just down the center. And of course, the assumption in those conversations is this is a great idea on paper, but there's a long way to go between idea to execution. And that's true. I believe one of the greatest challenges we have right now is being able to create a new type of leadership, a new way of governing to actually motivate action on these challenges. And we talk about the polls. I think we need to develop young leaders who don't just read the polls, but know how to change the polls. And that's a big piece of what we're doing with Millennial Action Project. I think great leaders can move people. They can move people to transcend their own self-interest, their own tribal interest, their own party's interest, and to get people to see themselves as part of a larger whole. There was a young President, Kennedy, who challenged people to give what they could, contribute what they could, and utilize their skill sets to put a person on the moon. There's a young leader in South Africa who reframed the conversation there on apartheid and said, we need to end apartheid not just for our community, but for the entire country. And if you look at the history of democracies, it's been often young leaders who have led the way in reframing issues. And the good news is that we're seeing those young leaders emerge today, and many of them are in our Millennial Action Project network. We have a group of these leaders on the Hill in the Future Caucus where I've seen them take courageous stands where they didn't just read the polls. They also saw where our country had to go. On the issue of the debt, I was so impressed when our vice chair in the last session, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, introduced the balanced budget amendment. She said, we do need to take fiscal responsibility seriously. And she said we should have balanced budgets most of the time, except in moments of recession or times of war. And she's a Democrat. I was also impressed when our co-chair, a Republican in the last session, decided to make climate change one of his primary issues. And not just that, he wasn't afraid to introduce one of the most politically difficult things to do on the Republican side, and that's introducing a carbon tax. And he said we should utilize these revenues and give it back to the American people. But just to even have in all of those articles the tax in there, a Republican leader who is willing to stand up for that really shows you some of the leaders who are coming out of this generation. And now both of the Republican co-chairs in our current session, Congressman Anthony Gonzalez and Congressman Lance Gooden, are both on the record saying that we need to take climate action. And when you look at these generational trends, actually, I become fairly optimistic. When you look at Republicans under the age of 50, a majority of them believe that we need to take action on climate. And we've been talking today about how this issue of climate change has a more personal feel. Let's just take stock of the fact that that's a huge accomplishment, because I remember 10 years ago working in the climate space where that was the big problem. The effects of climate change are too diffuse and it requires too much investment up front and people don't really want to act and it's not personal enough. Now we're seeing this assumption where that is true. And we are seeing these amazing activists like Greta Thunberg who are making it personal. So it just shows that, that happened in 10 years. Politics is a very human endeavor. And ideas in politics can reach the tipping point unexpectedly and exponentially. And I think we should take account of that. It is possible for that to happen in climate change. It is possible for that to happen with the national debt. Another example that really struck me recently, and a lot of examples we should be paying more attention to, is at the state level. Recently, we saw our Future Caucus in Iowa lead a renewable energy tour across the state. And we had Democrats and Republicans who were part of the legislature doing it. And I think we saw in real time how these young co-chairs of the Iowa caucus were leading the way in reframing the issue, and then more senior members of the legislature got on board with it. And they framed it in terms of why we need to make these investments in clean energy now so we can have stronger job opportunities for our citizens. They highlighted the fact that these jobs coming out are well-paying jobs to manufacture a wind turbine, to install a solar panel. And it was our Republican leaders who were making those points. Again, it just highlights this theme that when you can reframe issues in terms of the future versus the past, you can build these unlikely coalitions, get new ideas to the table. The final thing I'll say about this is I think our ability to act on generational issues like the debt and climate change are actually bigger than those individual issues. Our ability to act on these long-term threats are also about democracy itself. And sometimes you're sliding at about where you just feel hopeless because you have no agency and the urgency is really high. You can feel hopeless when you look at how democracy has performed in recent years. And you think about how, if you look at the debt, for example, the leaders who were primary authors of expanding the debt are no longer there, and the accountability isn't there either. So you wonder sometimes, because of this political cycle with democracy, that because you have this transfer of power, the accountability is so diffuse, people can move on. They're not held accountable for making these poor decisions. Does that mean democracy is not compatible with making long-term decisions? You could either frame it that way, or you could frame it a different way. Maybe it's because of democracy, the fact that we live in a diverse republic, because we believe in the principles of pluralism, maybe the fact that we believe in those things, that's why we actually solve these problems. And I've seen it in so many other contexts. I'm a musician. I see how in jazz, for example, when you have different ideas colliding together in a pluralistic setting, you create better music. My family has an engineering background. As an engineer, you want a diverse team because you have more ideas on the table and you can create better solutions. In business, there's study after study showing that executive leadership teams and boards of directors that are more diverse have better profits and better returns. Maybe it's because we live in a diverse democracy that we have a competition of ideas, as Madison talked about in the Federalist Papers. Maybe that's why we can solve these long-term problems. And if we can do that, I think we'll send a powerful statement about democracy and about the whole notion that people can govern themselves much better than one person can. So with that, I just want to say thank you for taking time to be here this morning. Thank you for being part of this conversation. If you want to get involved in Millennial Action Project, please reach out. And again, a big thank you to Brookings. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I want to thank you. I want to thank Representative Kilmer at the beginning. I want to thank the panelists who gave us such a robust and interesting conversation about these issues. This event is not the end of the event, in a sense. We saw this event as beginning what I hope will be a continuing conversation. The Millennial Action Project is I think, a crucially important organization, people associated with it. We're really glad to be involved with MAP on this issue. But we see this as the beginning of a conversation over time about how we look at these long-term issues, and particularly how those of us with some gray hair have to think differently about both communicating these issues, particularly the debt issue, which we're very heavily involved in, and how to get change in our political process. Certainly I've learned a lot today. It's really important, I think, for those of us here at Brookings and elsewhere that are focused on the budget and the budget process to think about how to reframe these issues. The reframing issue is so important, about thinking much more about what solutions will mean for the future. We're always whining about or complaining and getting frustrated about the dangers ahead, but the importance of how we can convey to people the benefit of a solution to these, I think, really came through very strongly. I think the whole issue of how our democracy functions, which is central to this, we felt that this whole issue of the debt and deficit is really a litmus test for whether our American democracy can handle these issues, these long-term issues, and how we can make it do so. And finally, the importance of young leaders. I mean, Derek Kilmer, others, Stephen, and others outside of the Congress are so important to this, and what the energy and the ideas that they bring to it. So speaking for the baby boom generation, which is an awesome responsibility for me, I think we've learned a lot today about how we work together with younger Americans, about how to think about these issues, how to frame them, how to enable our democracy to solve them. So thank you for being with us here today. You can keep on connecting with this project through our website and our work here at Brookings, and to be continued. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.